The damp air of Bradford clung to William Hardacre's coat as he pushed open the door to Charles Hodgson's druggist shop. Hardacre, a confectioner by trade, needed a fresh sack of daft, the cheap, gritty gypsum powder he routinely used to bulk out his peppermint lozenges. It was a common practice, stretching precious sugar to keep his penny sweets affordable for the factory workers who were his best customers. Hodgson's shelves were a crowded museum of Victorian commerce, tinctures in dark bottles, dried herbs in paper packets, and raw powders in plain, unmarked sacks. He had run out of daft, so he scribbled a note for his young apprentice. The boy was to hurry to the warehouse of the wholesale druggist, Joseph Neal, and fetch 12 pounds of the sugar substitute. The transaction was brisk, unremarkable, a simple errand in a busy industrial town. Back at his confectionery, Hardacre hefted the new sack onto his workbench. He untied the twine and peered inside at the fine white powder. It looked identical to the gypsum he always used, odorless, crystalline. Satisfied, he began measuring it out, ready to mix it with peppermint oil and gum into a sweet, minty dough. He had no reason to suspect the contents were not daft, but something far more lethal now sitting openly in his kitchen. Charles Hodgson's druggist shop was quiet that afternoon, the bell above the door stilled. With his own supply of daft exhausted, he dispatched his young apprentice with a note to Joseph Neal's wholesale warehouse. The boy's footsteps echoed through the narrow Bradford streets, the order for 12 pounds of harmless gypsum powder clutched in his hand. Neal's warehouse was a cavern of sacks and barrels. The apprentice found the bin for daft empty. His eyes scanned the adjacent shelves, landing on a nearly identical sack of fine white powder. He hefted it, noting only the scrawled word arsenic on the label. The stark skull and crossbones painted beneath went entirely unseen in the dim light. The boy hauled the heavy sack back to Hodgson's shop. The druggist, busy with another customer, gave the powder only a cursory glance. He assumed the warehouse had simply rebranded their stock. Without a second thought, he placed the lethal sack on the counter, ready for William Hardacre's collection. The poison now wore the perfect disguise of commerce. Back in his shop, William Hardacre tipped the fine white powder from the druggist's sack into his mixing bowl. He worked it together with peppermint oil and gum arabic, the sharp scent of mint filling the air as he kneaded the sticky mass. His hands moved with practiced rhythm, transforming the lethal powder into a pliable, fragrant dough. He dusted his wooden table with sugar and rolled the pale green dough into a long, even cylinder. The peppermint aroma was now overpowering, masking any chemical scent that might have clung to the powder. With a sharp blade, he sliced the roll into hundreds of identical discs, each one a perfect, innocent-looking humbug. The lozenges hardened on trays, their white surfaces dusted with powdered sugar. They looked and smelled exactly as they should, sweet, minty, and inviting. Hardacre packed them into paper bags ready for his market stall. In that moment, the confectioner held no suspicion that his entire batch was saturated with enough arsenic trioxide to kill a man with just a few pieces. The innocuous white lozenges, still fragrant with peppermint, passed from William Hardacre's hands into the pockets and palms of Bradford's factory workers that Saturday afternoon. For a single penny, mothers bought treats for their children. Men purchased something sweet to cut through the grime of the mill. The first piece dissolved on a tongue, releasing not just mint, but a fine, gritty powder that coated the throat. Within minutes, a deep, searing heat ignited in the stomachs of those who had eaten the candy. It was not mere indigestion, but a corrosive fire that climbed back up the esophagus. A weaver, clutching his middle, stumbled from his loom. A woman in her kitchen dropped a cup, her hands flying to her abdomen as the burning intensified, a metallic taste flooding her mouth. The poison was now coursing through scores of bodies, attacking from within. In cramped terraced houses and crowded factory yards, victims began retching, their systems trying violently to expel the intruder. A strange, garlic-like odour hung in the air around them, a scent that would soon become a ghastly signature, marking homes where a penny sweet had become a death sentence. The first wave of victims staggered home, clutching their stomachs. Within the hour, their bodies convulsed. They retched violently into basins, the vomit streaked with blood. Their bowels emptied in painful, watery bursts. Cramps twisted their abdomens into knots. In cramped, terraced houses across the city, the same horrific scene repeated itself as families watched loved ones collapse onto cold stone floors. A frantic knock came at Dr. John Henry Bell's door. He grabbed his bag and followed the messenger to a worker's cottage. The air inside was thick with the sour smell of sickness. Bell knelt beside a man shivering on a pallet. He leaned close, catching a faint, sweet odour on the patient's breath, the unmistakable scent of garlic. His suspicion tightened. At the next house, the evidence was overwhelming. Bell examined a bowl of vomit. He noted its peculiar bluish-white tint. He dipped a finger, touching it to his tongue. A sharp, metallic bitterness confirmed his dread. This was no simple cholera or food poisoning. The garlic breath, the metallic vomit, these were the classic, terrible signatures of arsenic. As the number of victims swelled, the initial confusion in Bradford's cramped streets hardened into a single, chilling certainty. This was no isolated incident. Dr. Bell, moving between stricken households, saw the same symptoms repeated in every quarter. He dispatched a breathless messenger back through the chaotic market, ordering the immediate seizure of every remaining lozenge from Hardacre's now deserted stall. The messenger returned, clutching a small paper bag of the suspect sweets. In the yard behind a chemist's shop, under a grim autumn sky, Bell and the local chemist prepared a crude but definitive test. They placed a single white lozenge on the flat blade of a fire shovel and held it directly over the flames of a coal fire. The heat worked quickly. The peppermint lozenge didn't just melt, it sublimated, transforming directly from a solid into a dense, curling plume of white vapour. Both men recoiled. Those fumes were unmistakable. The garlic-tinged ghost of arsenic trioxide rising from a child's candy, confirming the town's worst fears. With the source of the poison confirmed, the town bellman raced through Bradford's cobbled streets, his voice hoarse as he shouted a warning against the white peppermint lozenges. Families who had purchased the candy just hours before now huddled in their kitchens, staring at the innocuous sweets with dawning horror. The message was simple and terrifying. Return what you bought, and do not eat a single piece. The most gravely ill were carried into the cold, austere halls of the Bradford workhouse, transformed into an emergency hospital. On rows of makeshift cots, doctors bent over writhing patients, forcing rubber tubes down their throats. Stomach pumps hissed and gurgled, trying to evacuate the toxic paste before it could seep further into their systems. But for many, the burning damage was already done. As a last resort, physicians administered the era's standard antidote, a thick brown slurry of hydrated ferric oxide and magnesia, known as arsenic eater's powder. They hoped it would bind to the poison in the gut. Nurses tipped the mixture past blue-tinged lips, but the treatment proved tragically futile. The arsenic had already been absorbed, its corrosive work marching relentlessly through the bloodstream. As the last of the victims were buried, the coroner's inquest opened in a crowded Bradford courtroom, thick with public fury. The apprentice druggist, his hands trembling, took the stand first. He described the warehouse's dim light, the identical Hessian sacks, and his fatal confusion between the bins marked daft and the one bearing the crude skull and crossbones. Next, Charles Hodgson, the local druggist, defended his actions, claiming he had trusted his supplier. Then Joseph Neal, the wholesale druggist, faced the jury. He admitted that arsenic trioxide and the harmless gypsum daft were stored side by side in his warehouse, separated only by a few feet of wooden floor, a common but lethal practice of the trade. After days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of death by misadventure, citing gross negligence in the storage of a deadly poison adjacent to a food ingredient. No criminal charges were filed. The ruling was a legal dead end, but it etched a damning truth into the public record. The supply chain itself had been poisoned by indifference. The inquest's verdict of gross negligence settled the legal matter, but it did nothing to stem the rising tide of grief and anger in Bradford. By the final count, 20 people had died, men, women and children whose names filled the local burial registers. Over 200 more survived, but they were left weakened, their bodies forever marked by the ordeal. In homes across the industrial town, drawn curtains and black crepe spoke of a community in mourning, united by a shared poisonous pennyworth. The story, however, would not remain confined to Yorkshire. Illustrated weeklies like the Illustrated London News dispatched artists to Bradford. Their engravings, published nationwide, showed readers the innocuous-looking white lozenges and, crucially, the plain, unmarked paper sacks in which the arsenic had been stored. These images transformed an abstract tragedy into a visceral, visual warning. For the first time, the British public could see with their own eyes how a deadly poison had been packaged identically to a harmless food ingredient. That visual evidence ignited a firestorm. Editorial pages from London to Glasgow thundered with condemnation, demanding answers. How could a system allow such a lethal mix-up? Who was responsible for protecting the public from their own groceries? The debate shifted from local negligence to a national crisis of confidence. The plain paper sack, now a symbol of fatal carelessness, became the central exhibit in a pressing new question about the government's duty to ensure the safety of what its people ate. The inquest verdict of gross negligence echoed through newspaper columns from Bradford to London, but it offered no criminal convictions, no prison sentences. For a public still reeling from images of plain paper sacks holding arsenic, this legal impasse felt like a failure. The outrage did not dissipate. It crystallized. Letters flooded parliamentary offices demanding that such a catastrophe must never happen again. Inside the Palace of Westminster, that public pressure met the slow gears of government. Members of Parliament, many of whom had read the same harrowing reports, began drafting legislation. Their debates centred on a simple, radical idea. The government should have the power to inspect food, to test its contents, and to punish those who knowingly sold dangerous, adulterated products to an unsuspecting public. In 1860, that idea became law. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act passed, creating some of Britain's first legal standards for food purity. For the first time, it became an offence to mix poisonous ingredients into consumables. The act was limited and enforcement was weak, but a precedent was set. The 20 deaths in Bradford had finally compelled the state to acknowledge a duty to protect the dinner table.